Well, when I was a kid, and one of my television shows that I liked to watch was a two-parter, then I knew that must be something really special. Sadly, I don't know how special this two-part study of II Thessalonians 2 is going to be, but we'll give it our best shot. It's good to be with you all again tonight. I began with you on Wednesday a study of II Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 12. We got down through verse 3. We had also done quite a bit of background work and put some pieces on the table that are like puzzle pieces that we're trying to fit together. We know what the big picture of the puzzle is going to be. It's going to be Paul saying to the Thessalonians, I know you've heard that the day of the Lord has taken place, that Jesus has come back. That's not true. And the reason we know that it is not true is because a couple of things that I told you are going to happen have not taken place yet. Namely, an apostasy or rebellion. And then secondly, the coming of someone called the man of lawlessness. So we're going to get now into verse 4, where we start to try to understand who this man of lawlessness is. Here's how Paul describes him. Who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Now, who or exactly what is Paul talking about when he talks about someone who is taking his place in the temple of God, claiming to be God himself? We actually have a clue, and that clue is found in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 contains a prophecy that has to do with the conflict that I mentioned in the previous lesson that was going to occur in the period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. The conflict involves generals, kings from the country of Syria, launching invasions against Israel and persecuting the Jewish people. When Daniel sees this and describes what's going to happen in that period between the Testaments, listen to the way that he describes one king in particular. He says this in Daniel chapter 11, starting in verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Later he says in verse 36, and the king shall do as he wills, he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. Now we know who Daniel is talking about. He's talking about a king whose name was Antiochus IV, one of the descendants of one of the successors of Alexander the Great. And we know that not only did he launch wars against the Jewish people and desecrate the temple, he also took divine honors for himself. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. You know, an epiphany is an appearing or a manifestation of God. So that's what he called himself. He was Antiochus, God manifest. The Jews called him not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, the madman, the mad one, because of his persecutions. Now, Jesus, in his discussion of the signs of the destruction of the temple, refers to this passage and another related passage in Daniel chapter 9, that talks about this abomination. You remember it says here in Daniel 11 and verse 31 that they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. In Matthew 24, Jesus told the disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's when you know to get out of Jerusalem, because that means the end is at hand. Now notice, Daniel 11 is about pagan generals who are going to invade the land of Israel. Matthew 24 is about pagan generals who are going to invade the land of Israel. So that's why I'm sure Jesus drew on the language of Daniel as a way to find, you know how when you search for pictures and you search for images, And what you want to do is you want to find some kind of image that sort of represents what it is that you're talking about. And so, like when I was looking for an image for my back to school lesson, I wanted to look for images of schools because you want to find something that when you look at that image, it sends a familiar message. Well, using the invasion of Antiochus, the madman, as an image of what happens when pagans fall upon Jerusalem is exactly what Jesus was doing in Matthew chapter 24. Well, I think Paul is doing something similar here. And that is, he's taking this language about someone exalting themselves, even in connection with the temple, but applying it to a pagan persecutor and someone who is making war against the people of God. You also see the same thing in Revelation 13, in that passage I studied with you earlier this summer. So that's why I'm saying to you that this is kind of like using a stock image. It's one picture, but it can be applied over and over again. In Revelation chapter 13, John picks on some more of these stock images from Daniel. So let me show you what I'm talking about. And I think you'll see how this kind of ties into this passage here in II Thessalonians. If you look with me in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel 2 talks about the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which is that statue made of 4 parts that are different metals that refer to different kingdoms. Daniel 7 is Daniel's dream, and he sees the same thing, except this time, instead of 4 parts of a statue, it's 4 kinds of animals that are described in these, grotesque terms, almost like you're watching a horror movie. And in his discussion of the 4th of these animals, parallel to the 4th kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar sees in Daniel 2, which we know to be the kingdom of Rome, then he says this in Daniel 7, verse 19. Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time when the saints possessed the kingdom. Now, if you go from there to Revelation chapter 13, you're going to see John pick, again, some of this stock imagery as he describes the Roman Empire, personified especially in Nero. So in Revelation 13, verse 1, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns, 7 heads, blasphemous names on its heads. The animals that he describes in verse 2 are the very animals in Daniel 7. They're just kind of all combined together. The end of verse 2 says, to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority, working in league with the devil. Verse 3, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. When I talked with you about this passage in the summer, I suggested that's a reference to Nero's suicide, but yet the Roman Empire itself managed to survive. And then notice in verse 4, they worshiped the dragon, for he given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast. So the Roman emperors began to demand worship as gods themselves. Notice also, dropping down to verse 7, that just like in Daniel 7, in Revelation 13:7, this figure makes war on the saints to conquer them. So here's what I am suggesting for you. If you look at all of this together, Daniel 11, Daniel 7, Matthew 24, Revelation 13, and now 2 Thessalonians 2, we keep seeing these refrains of pictures of foreigners that are like monsters that are attacking the people of God, persecuting the people of God. The specific historical reference may be slightly different, but it's just a common set of images that the Bible writers are pulling from. So when Paul here now in II Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about someone who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, I can easily see that as a way of describing the Roman emperors, like Nero, and then like those who came after him, who demanded to be worshiped as God. In fact, just a few years before Paul wrote this letter, one of the craziest of the early Caesars, whose name was Gaius, popularly known as Caligula, which is a nickname given because he used to wear a little army outfit. Anyway, he went crazy, and one of the things he wanted to do was to have a statue of himself set up in the Jewish temple. And fortunately, he was assassinated by his own bodyguard before that actually took place. So I think what Paul is doing here is he's drawing on these stock images to describe a pagan ruler who intends to demand for himself worship and also to persecute the people of God. Someone like Nero is an example of this. I don't think that this has to be exclusively Nero. I think it can refer to just Roman emperors in general, but the idea of imperial persecution that is rooted in idolatry, I think, is the thing that Paul is talking about here. And I think what he's saying to the Thessalonians is, look, I told you something like this was going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. And if that hasn't happened yet, then of course Jesus could not have come back. All right, well, let's go on now back in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 5. Paul says, do you not remember when I was still with you? I told you these things, and I'm thinking, I wish I'd been there so I could have heard it and at least gotten it from Paul himself. Although it seems like the Thessalonians were still confused about it. So maybe that would not have been a perfect solution. We've pointed out in previous lessons that Paul says this kind of thing a lot in these letters. And I've given you the references here pulled together by one of the commentators that I like to read in preparation for class, that Paul likes to, in these short letters, over and over again, talks about, here's what you already know, here's what you've already heard, remember what I said to you. And that's what he's doing here especially. Verse 6, and you know what is restraining him now so that he may be revealed in his time. So, we've got one puzzle, what is the rebellion or apostasy? We've got another puzzle, who is this man of lawlessness? And now we have another puzzle. There is something that is a restraining power against this man of lawlessness. Well, it's a puzzle piece for us, but apparently not so much for the Thessalonians. Paul seems to think they know what it is. He says, you know what is restraining him. So how you understand this restraining power depends largely on who or what you think the man of lawlessness is. If you think the man of lawlessness maybe is Satan, then perhaps the restraining power is the Holy Spirit. Some have even suggested maybe it's Paul's preaching of the gospel, that the gospel is restraining Satan. If, as I tend to think, the man of lawlessness is one of the Roman emperors or just the imperial Rome itself represented by its kings, then maybe what's restraining him is God's will, God's providence. Or it may have been that what is restraining him is an emperor who's not crazy. The emperor who was Nero's predecessor was named Claudius, and as far as pagans go, he wasn't such a bad guy. He is mentioned in the book of Acts, in Acts 18. He was the Caesar that evicted the Jews from Rome, but so far as we know, did nothing to harm Christians, did nothing to persecute them. Some people think that the Emperor Claudius, who would have been in power when Paul wrote this letter, is the restraining force holding evil back in terms of his successor, Nero. That's a possibility. Anyway, verse something is holding back whoever this man of lawlessness is, so that he is not quite yet revealed. However, whatever spirit is behind him is already at work. Verse 7 says, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Now, what this could mean is that if the man of lawlessness is Satan, Paul is saying, we haven't seen him on full display yet, but you can certainly see his handiwork. If he means that the man of lawlessness is something like a Roman emperor, he may mean that, full-on persecution rooted in idolatry has not happened yet, but the seeds have been sown by the idolatry that has already started to crop up. Thessalonica was one of those cities where there was a very strong emperor cult. And so it may be that Paul is saying this hasn't mushroomed completely yet, but we already are kind of seeing the inklings of it. And verse 7 says, only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. So now he talks about the restraining thing as not a thing, but a person, which, again, if the man of lawlessness is Satan, maybe God himself who is restraining him, although that doesn't seem possible because whoever is restraining him is going to be out of the way at some point, and God's not going to be out of the way. If, as I think, it may be one of the emperors or imperial Rome, what Paul is saying is there's somebody kind of restraining this evil now, but will be out of the way, like perhaps Emperor Claudius, or maybe a Jewish advisor, or some other kind of advisor who was helping to keep tabs on what will eventually happen. All right, so remember what our big picture is here. Paul is saying, don't be disturbed in thinking that the second coming has already happened. I told you about some things in the future. They haven't happened yet, so the second coming hasn't happened yet. One of those involves the man of lawlessness. He has not been revealed yet. The time has not yet come. There is someone and something kind of holding him back. Until verse 8. And then the lawless one will be revealed. And if it is an emperor sort of like Nero, then Paul is saying that there will be a time in God's purpose when he will be out in the open. If the lawless one is Satan, as some commentators think, then perhaps Paul is saying he will be revealed as the true power behind all that's been going on. Kind of like at the end of a mystery novel when the detective tells you who did it, Or maybe at the end of The Wizard of Oz when the curtain is pulled back and you see who the wizard is. Well, whenever this happens, it's not going to go well for this man of lawlessness, because Paul goes on to say in verse 8, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. Whether it is an earthly ruler or whether it is a diabolical ruler like Satan, all of them are going to be put to an end by the Lord Jesus. The language here, by the breath of his mouth, is another stock image. It comes from the book of Isaiah, from Isaiah chapter 11, and it's a way of describing someone's word. You don't think about it, but when you speak, you breathe. That's why there's concern about the virus being spread by talking close to someone or singing close to someone, because when you speak or when you sing, you're breathing. Well, in Isaiah chapter 11, there's a picture of the Messiah. And it says in Isaiah 11, verse 4, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. And I've given you some references in the notes in Revelation which say the same thing. And so whatever power exalts itself against the Lord and his people, whether it is Jerusalem and its religious establishment, whether it is imperial Rome, whether it is Satan himself, the Lord Jesus, by his word, will bring them all to an end. All right, now then, verse 9. The coming of the lawless one, Paul says, is, my translation says, by the activity of Satan. Now, you may be wondering, well, how is it that some people think that the lawless one is Satan, when here Paul says the lawless one does what he does by the help of Satan? But there is another way to translate this verse. The New Revised Standard Version puts it like this: the coming of the lawless one is apparent in the work of Satan, which would kind of support the identification of the lawless one with Satan. If they are separate, which is what I tend to think, then nevertheless they work closely with each other. And you may recall from Revelation 13, that is exactly the point. That in Revelation 13, John says that the beast from the sea does the bidding of the dragon. And so what what John is talking about there in Revelation 13 is when the Roman Empire comes under the control of the evil one and then begins to try to enforce idolatry and also to persecute the people of God. And so that also means, by the way, that this choice I've been talking with you about how to understand who the lawless one is, whether it's maybe Satan or a human ruler of some kind, is not necessarily a mutually exclusive choice, particularly given the way that in Revelation chapter 13, the relationship between the two is described. All right, now notice the next part of verse 9. After Paul says the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, he says, with all power and false signs and wonders. Now, again, this is sort of, if you were to pick from a standard set of warnings about a time of evil involving pagan powers and involving a falling away, the idea of the use of false signs and wonders would be in that set of things that you could pick from. When Jesus talked about what would happen before the destruction of the temple in Matthew chapter 24, he says at the very end, before the temple falls, verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. And over in Revelation chapter 13, when John pictures the worldwide sweep of idolatry in the Roman Empire and the imperial cult, he says in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 12, or verse 13, it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth. So I guess the thing I want you to see is that the language in II Thessalonians chapter 2 may be hard for us to pinpoint, but it is not odd language in light of the full scope of biblical revelation. I think that's what Marty's point was. I was joking about last time in his first class on 2 Thessalonians 2, he talked about how easy this passage was. But I think what he was saying is, if you are really familiar with this language, then what Paul talks about here is not some novelty. The things that he mentions, like a falling away from the faith, a persecutor who seeks to be honored as God, and the use of false signs and wonders to deceive the world, is the kind of thing you read about a lot, actually, in the Bible. The only question here is sort of trying to narrow down what time frame maybe Paul specifically had in mind. Of course, this also calls to mind, again, I'm saying to you that this is like a standard set of descriptions because history has a tendency to repeat itself. It also brings to mind the ultimate evil of a pagan power against the people of God in the Old Testament, which is Pharaoh in Exodus. And remember that Pharaoh's magicians could do a couple of the signs. They certainly couldn't do what Moses and Aaron could do. And also remember that what happened is that because they could do those signs, Pharaoh ends up becoming hardened and stubborn against God. And you know what happens after that. So think about that as we finish out this chapter. So we are at verse 10 now. Paul says, 2 Thessalonians 2:10, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So the lawless one, empowered by Satan to do these false signs and wonders, deceives people wickedly, but they are deceived because they refuse to love the truth. They didn't receive the love of the truth. They have no desire for the truth. And so therefore they will be gullible. They will fall away because of these signs. So, verse 11, therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Just as God hardened Pharaoh's heart after Pharaoh had spurned God and his word, God gives these stubborn sinners what they want. They want a delusion. That is exactly what God gives them. And this then will just simply hasten their rightful judgment. This reminds me of the story. You might remember it. It wasn't that long ago in our daily Bible reading in 1 Kings 22 when Ahab and Jehoshaphat are thinking about going up to fight to recapture Ramoth Gilead from the Syrians. And Ahab says, well, let's go up and fight. And Jehoshaphat says, well, shouldn't we hear from a prophet? So Ahab's court prophet, I think his name is Zedekiah, gives them a false prophecy. And Jehoshaphat says, well, can't I hear from a true prophet? So they send for the one that Ahab doesn't like, whose name is Micaiah. And Micaiah says, I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a lying spirit go to the Lord and say, can I go deceive Ahab? And the Lord says, yes. Ahab wants to be deceived. God's going to give him what he wants. You also see this language in that repeated statement found in Romans 1, where Paul says that after the Gentile world rejected God, that God gave them over to what they wanted, to their degrading behavior. One of the commentaries that I've been looking at contained a statement that I thought was so good, I actually quoted it and put it in the notes for you. In our age, when truth is increasingly viewed as relative and personal, thoughts about the power and consequences of embracing error move to the periphery. The apostolic perspective is that there is a right way and a wrong way, and that the power of Satan is and will be powerfully operative to assure that people in the end will be eternally lost. The stakes in the battle for truth and against error could not be higher. And I think that's exactly right, and a very telling statement about our culture. Whew. I'll tell you, I'm worn out. There are days when I tackle a text in the Bible and I feel like I've got a really good hand on it. And then there are days when I think that text has put the big elbow smash on me. This has definitely been one of those texts. But we can put some things together here and I think get, in my view at least, the general sense of what Paul wants the Thessalonians to know. Thessalonians, the Lord has not come back yet. The Lord hasn't come back because I told you about some things that are going to be happening. From my understanding, I think Paul even means relatively soon, and you haven't seen these yet. There's going to be a falling away from the faith, and there is going to be this persecution, this man of lawlessness who seeks to be worshipped and persecutes those who do not worship him. And if that hasn't happened yet, then of course the Lord's return has not happened. Now, let me hasten to say that just because I think that what Paul is talking about here was going to take place relatively soon in the time of the Thessalonians, that does not mean that there will not be future outbreaks of terrible evil and persecution before the Lord returns. As a matter of fact, I think there is a passage in the Bible in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10, that teaches that is exactly going to happen, that there is going to be a horrible time of persecution before the Lord comes back. I recognize Revelation is a very figurative, symbolic book, and I don't want to press that point too much. I just don't want us to think that this kind of thing could not happen again. I think it absolutely could. But I think that the point for the Thessalonians was, don't be misled, because if you think the Lord's return has already happened, you've lost your hope for all that the Lord's return means, which is the resurrection and our new life in eternity with him. Don't think that you're stuck in your suffering. You're not. The Lord has still yet to finally and ultimately redeem his people. Well, one last quote. I don't quote stuff to you guys a lot. I try to do my best to summarize and put things in my own words that I read, but sometimes people say things so well, you just have to pass it along. So I conclude with this from another commentator named N.T. Wright. God will judge during history and finally at the end of history itself the imperial systems that put themselves in his place. There have been enough of these in our own recent past for us to see something of the way they operate, the deceits they weave, and the way in which people get caught up in the web of their lies. What Paul would have us urgently grasp is the fact that God remains sovereign over all and will one day put all wrongs to rights and bring all human empires under the rule and judgment of his own saving kingdom. I think that's the big takeaway for the Thessalonians and for us. Well, I've enjoyed studying this passage with you because you know what? It's good to get the sense that you got your lunch handed to you sometimes when you're a preacher. It's good to be humble, and this passage is certainly a humbling one for sure. But the big point should most of all be an encouraging one. We still have a redemption that is yet to take place, and we have a hope to long for, and we can be encouraged by that. Well, thank you for studying with me, and we'll move ahead in 2 Thessalonians 2 and on into chapter 3, Lord willing, in our next study.